At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Donald Trump opened his Truth Social account and typed a sentence that no sitting president of the United States has ever typed before. He wrote, "A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again." And then he added, "I don't want that to happen, but it probably will. We will find out tonight." One of the most important moments in the long and complex history of the world. That was not a press conference. That was not a prepared diplomatic communication reviewed by advisors and legal counsel and foreign policy staff. That was a social media post. From the most powerful military commander on earth. Addressed to 93 million people in Iran. Informing them that their civilization was probably going to end in a matter of hours unless their government opened a waterway. And then, approximately 6 hours after those words were posted, Donald Trump opened Truth Social again and announced a ceasefire. I am Michael Turner. And this video is about what happened in those 6 hours. Because what happened between that post at 2 in the afternoon and the ceasefire announcement at 6:32 in the evening is one of the most compressed, most dramatic, and most consequential diplomatic sequences in modern history. 6 hours in which the fate of 93 million Iranians was in play. 6 hours in which the global oil market, the NATO alliance, and the future of the Middle East hung simultaneously on conversations being conducted in Islamabad, in Washington, and in Tehran between people who did not trust each other, racing against a self-imposed deadline that the entire world was watching. 6 hours in which two Pakistani officials, a prime minister and a field marshal, were essentially the only human beings standing between the world and the most catastrophic bombing campaign against civilian infrastructure since the Second World War. 6 hours that most of the world's media has already moved past without fully explaining what actually happened inside them. Let me take you back to the beginning of that day. Because Tuesday did not start with the civilization post. It started with bombs. The U.S. military had promised this day would be the most intensive bombing of the entire war. And it delivered. U.S. and Israeli jets struck military infrastructure on Karg Island, Iran's main oil export terminal, in an intense overnight wave before dawn. Israel hit one of the few remaining petrochemical facilities in Shiraz that was still producing materials used in ballistic missile production. Another missile site was struck in northwestern Iran. Infrastructure was hit across the country in multiple simultaneous waves. Israel sent a warning on social media to Iranian civilians telling them not to travel by train and to stay away from railway lines. The implication was explicit. Rail infrastructure was about to be targeted. Sirens activated across the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain as Iran continued firing drones and missiles at Gulf neighbors. Iran fired back into central Israel, into Saudi Arabia, and into Bahrain, forcing the closure of the King Fahd Causeway, the bridge linking Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, a critical piece of Gulf infrastructure shut by war for the first time in its history. And then at 2 o'clock in the afternoon Washington time, with the 8 o'clock deadline still 6 hours away, Trump posted those words. A whole civilization will die tonight. He was not speaking about soldiers. He was not speaking about military targets. He was speaking about Iran as a civilization. About power plants that supply electricity to 93 million people. About bridges that connect cities. About water treatment facilities that provide drinking water to entire provinces. About hospitals. About schools. About the accumulated infrastructure of a society that has existed in some form for 3,000 years. And the world exploded. Former Speaker Nancy Pelosi said Trump's instability had become more clear and more dangerous than ever and called on Republicans to reconvene Congress to end the war. Former Human Rights Watch Executive Director Kenneth Roth said Trump was openly threatening collective punishment of civilians, which violates the Fourth Geneva Convention, and that making such threats is itself potentially a war crime. Pope Leo XIV, the first American pope, called the threat truly unacceptable and urged people of goodwill to contact their political leaders to demand they reject war and work for peace. More than 80 congressional Democrats were reported to be supporting 25th Amendment action against Trump over his conduct. The 25th Amendment is the constitutional provision that allows the vice president and a cabinet majority to remove a president from office if he is determined to be unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. The fact that dozens of elected officials were seriously discussing invoking it in real time, while a deadline for civilization-level destruction was ticking down on social media, tells you exactly what the political atmosphere in Washington looked like during those 6 hours. And in Tehran, something happened that no Western analyst had predicted. The Iranian government called on its citizens to become human shields. Iranian officials asked civilians to form human chains around the country's power plants, to physically stand between their electrical infrastructure and the bombs they believed were coming within hours. Iranian state media showed hundreds of ordinary Iranians responding to that call. Gathering around power plants. Linking arms. Standing in the dark outside the facilities that kept their cities lit and their hospitals running, believing that the presence of their own bodies might deter American pilots. Video of those human chains circulated on social media and was seen by millions of people worldwide while the diplomatic clock was still ticking. Iran's president posted that more than 14 million Iranians had registered to sacrifice their lives to defend the country. He wrote that he too had been, was, and would remain devoted to giving his life for Iran. Iran's foreign ministry told reporters that American officials had been trying to intimidate Iranians with such language for 48 years, and that Iranians would not be subdued by deadlines. But behind the defiant public posture, something very different was happening in private. The ceasefire story actually begins not at 2 in the afternoon when Trump posted his civilization threat, and not at midnight when the clock started. It begins in Islamabad, where Pakistan had been quietly engineering a last-ditch framework for the previous 48 hours. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir, the head of Pakistan's military, had been in direct communication with both sides throughout Monday night and Tuesday morning. Pakistan had been serving as the primary channel between Washington and Tehran throughout this entire 40-day war. And in those final hours, its role became the most consequential piece of diplomacy the conflict had produced. At some point during Tuesday afternoon, Sharif publicly posted on social media asking Trump for a 2-week extension of his deadline. He tagged Trump directly. He tagged Vice President J.D. Vance. He tagged Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He tagged Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. And he tagged Iranian leaders in the same post. He asked Iran to open the strait for 2 weeks as a goodwill gesture. He asked all warring parties to observe a ceasefire everywhere for 2 weeks to allow diplomacy to achieve a conclusive end to the war. This was not a private diplomatic cable. This was a public intervention in real time on social media, witnessed by the entire world, at the moment of maximum tension, by the leader of a nuclear-armed nation that had positioned itself as the last available bridge between two governments that had no direct channel to each other. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt was asked for a comment on Pakistan's request within minutes of the post going live. Her answer was 3 words. The president has been made aware of the proposal and a response will come. 3 words. Has been made aware. That told everyone watching that the conversation inside the White House had just shifted. That someone in that building was reading Sharif's post and taking it seriously. And then came the detail that almost nobody has reported clearly enough. Iran made its move simultaneously. Iran's Supreme National Security Council communicated through Pakistani intermediaries that it was ready to accept the 2-week pause. Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi confirmed that safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz would be possible via coordination with Iran's armed forces. Not unconditional passage. Coordinated passage. Iran was not surrendering the strait. Iran was offering to manage traffic through it on its own terms during the ceasefire window. A crucial distinction that would become one of the most contested elements of the agreement within hours of it being announced. And simultaneously, Iran sent to the United States its 10-point proposal for a comprehensive agreement to permanently end the war. The proposal included controlled passage through the strait, compensation for war damages, withdrawal of U.S. forces from regional bases, and lifting of sanctions. Trump would later describe this proposal as workable. He called it a workable basis on which to negotiate. At 6:32 in the evening Eastern Time, 90 minutes before his self-imposed deadline of 8 o'clock expired, Donald Trump posted the ceasefire announcement. He wrote, based on conversations with Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir of Pakistan, and wherein they requested that I hold off the destructive force being sent tonight to Iran, and subject to the Islamic Republic of Iran agreeing to the complete, immediate, and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz, I agree to suspend the bombing and attack of Iran for a period of 2 weeks. He called it a double-sided ceasefire. He said the U.S. had received a 10-point proposal from Iran and believed it was a workable basis on which to negotiate. He said almost all of the various points of past contention had been agreed to between the United States and Iran. And then he wrote that it was an honor to have this long-term problem close to resolution. The reaction was immediate and global. Oil prices, which had surged to $117 a barrel earlier on Tuesday, plunged 8% in minutes, dropping back toward the $100 range. Stock futures around the world began surging. Dow futures jumped 725 points. Japan's Nikkei soared more than 2,600 points. South Korea's Kospi jumped 6%. Iranian state television showed crowds gathering in Tehran's Enqilab Square, the square of the Islamic Revolution, celebrating what they understood as survival. As the moment the bombs that were supposed to fall did not fall. Pakistan's Prime Minister Sharif announced the ceasefire was effective immediately and invited both delegations to Islamabad for talks on Friday. The United States and Iran are expected to hold peace talks in Pakistan's capital with Vice President J.D. Vance likely leading the American delegation. Now, here is where this story gets complicated. Because the ceasefire announced with such drama and celebrated so widely immediately began revealing the fractures underneath it. And those fractures matter enormously for what comes next. The first fracture appeared within hours. Missiles were still being fired from Iran toward Israel and Gulf states even after the ceasefire was officially announced. A U.S. defense official acknowledged that it might take time for the ceasefire order to filter down through the lower ranks of the Revolutionary Guard, whose commanders had been making targeting decisions independently throughout the war. This is not a minor technical detail. The IRGC is not a conventional military structure that stops shooting the moment a political leader signs an agreement. Individual IRGC commanders have been running this war with significant operational autonomy. Whether they agreed to stand down because Tehran told them to was genuinely in question hours after the announcement. The second fracture emerged from Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu's office issued a statement saying Israel supports Trump's decision to suspend strikes against Iran. And then added a sentence that directly contradicted Pakistan's position. The statement said the 2-week ceasefire does not include Lebanon. Pakistan's Prime Minister had stated explicitly that the ceasefire applies in Lebanon and elsewhere. These two statements are directly contradictory. And they represent a potential unraveling mechanism built into this deal from the moment it was announced. Because if Israel continues military operations in Lebanon under the premise that Lebanon is excluded, and if Iran continues supporting Hezbollah because it considers Lebanon part of the same conflict, the ceasefire could collapse before the Islamabad talks even begin. The third fracture is the most strategically significant. Iran's 10-point proposal, which Trump called workable, includes terms that are either extremely ambitious or completely incompatible with Israeli positions depending on who reads them. The proposal calls for controlled passage through Hormuz, meaning Iran retains supervisory authority over the waterway it has been using as a weapon. It calls for compensation for all war damages, meaning financial reparations from the United States and Israel for 40 days of bombing. It calls for withdrawal of U.S. forces from all regional bases. These are not minor negotiating positions. These are maximalist demands that would require extraordinary concessions from Washington. Trump called them workable. The Israeli government is skeptical the deal can hold. And the gap between workable in Trump's framing and acceptable in practice remains vast. There is also the deeper question of what this ceasefire actually achieved in terms of the original stated objectives of the war. Before the war began, the Strait of Hormuz was open. Ships transited freely. Oil moved at approximately 130 vessels per day without Iranian supervision or Iranian fees. 40 days of the most intensive American bombing campaign since the Second World War later, the strait is still not fully open. Iran is offering coordinated passage on its own terms. Meaning ships that want to transit must coordinate with Iran's armed forces. Must receive Iranian permission. Must pay fees that Iran's parliament has formally codified into law during the war. And the IRGC Navy stated clearly in the hours after the ceasefire announcement that the situation in the Strait of Hormuz will never return to what it was before the war, especially for the United States and Israel. Iran fought this war. Absorbed the assassination of its supreme leader. Absorbed unprecedented destruction of its military and economic infrastructure. Lost more than 2,000 of its people including hundreds of children. And came out of it with a formal acknowledgement from the United States that Iranian coordination is required for ships to transit a waterway that international law has always held is open to all nations. Whether that is a victory for Iran or a defeat depends entirely on who writes the history. And history is not yet written. Now let me give you the human accounting of what this 40-day war actually cost. Because no ceasefire announcement and no peace talks in Islamabad changes these numbers or brings back the people behind them. More than 2,000 people killed in Iran. Hundreds of children among them. More than 20,000 injured. 82,000 civilian structures damaged or destroyed. 18 hospitals struck. More than 1,400 killed in Lebanon. More than 1 million Lebanese displaced from their homes. 13 American service members killed. More than 300 wounded. The 170 children who died in the Minab school strike on the first day of the war. The Pasteur Institute, a century-old medical research center that gave Iranians their vaccines, destroyed. Sharif University of Technology, Iran's equivalent of MIT, bombed. The 9 civilians killed in a synagogue shelter in Beit Shemesh. The 4 members of one family killed when an interceptor missed an incoming missile and it hit a residential building in Haifa. These are the things that Trump's ceasefire announcement does not undo. Cannot undo. That no deal negotiated in Islamabad will ever fully address. They are the permanent cost of 40 days of war between nuclear-armed and nearly nuclear-armed powers in the most energy-critical region on Earth. What happens in the next 2 weeks will determine whether this becomes the turning point that leads to a lasting agreement or merely the pause before the next escalation. The questions that need answers are enormous. Does Iran actually reopen the strait in the way the United States expects, or does Iranian coordinated passage mean something functionally different from what Washington believes it agreed to? Does Israel continue its campaign in Lebanon? Do the IRGC commanders who have been running this war with autonomous targeting authority actually stand down and stay down? Does the 10-point Iranian proposal survive contact with American and Israeli negotiating positions in Islamabad? Does this 2-week window produce a permanent framework or simply reset the clock for a new round of threats and deadlines and civilization posts? 6 hours. That is how long stood between a presidential threat to extinguish a civilization and a ceasefire. 6 hours brokered by Pakistan carrying messages between 2 governments that do not trust each other, against a deadline set by a president who had moments earlier written that a whole civilization would probably die that night. The civilization did not die. But the war that nearly killed it has left behind a region, an international order, and a set of unanswered questions that the world will be living with long after the Islamabad talks conclude. I am Michael Turner. Subscribe and turn on notifications right now because the Islamabad talks begin in days. And what emerges from those negotiations will define the Middle East for a generation. I will be covering every development the moment it breaks. Tell me in the comments. Do you believe Iran came out of this 40-day war with more leverage than it had before the bombs started falling? Or did the United States achieve what it set out to accomplish? And do you think this ceasefire holds? I will see you in the next update.